The sun had bled itself dry across the plains by the time Marin reached the edge of town, its last breath of gold sinking beneath a smudge of dust and distant pine. Her boots scraped the earth with each dragging step, worn leather soaked through with melted snow and old blood. The twins, her daughters, were tied close to her chest, bundled in the torn sleeves of her wedding dress, now gray with dirt and ash. Their breaths were faint but still there. Her own lips were split, one eye bruised purple and swollen to a slit. She'd walked 5 miles through brush and frost with no saddle, no coat, and no promise that anyone would answer when she knocked. She passed the blacksmith first. He looked once and turned again to his fire. Then the mercantile, where a woman behind the window touched her own cheek, as if feeling the blow on Marin's face. But she didn't open the door. The town was quiet, like it knew her shame before she could say a word. The sheriff's office still had smoke curling from the stovepipe. Marin knocked once, her hand trembling. The door creaked open, and Sheriff Alden looked her up and down without standing from his chair. "Go on to the church," he said. "Not my place to house the fallen." "The girls," she whispered. He shook his head, already closing the door. "I don't do babies, and I don't do widows who stir trouble." So she went to the church. The steps creaked under her weight, her knees buckling. A woman opened the chapel door, eyes sharp behind a cross-stitched shawl. "We don't house disgrace," she said plainly, then pulled the door shut again. The girl started to stir, hungry and cold. Marin slid down the steps, legs folding beneath her like they'd given up the long fight. Her arms wrapped tighter around the infants. She buried her face against the soft warmth of their heads and let the pain rise in her chest like bile. From a far end of the street, the sound of a single horse approached. Callum Hart rode like a man who didn't care if his name was known. Broad-shouldered, with a long coat the wind didn't dare lift, he moved through town like a ghost with weight. The reins were leathered and frayed, his hat low over eyes that had seen too much fire and too few miracles. He'd lost his own once, a wife, a boy, and hadn't let anyone near since. He didn't come to town for mercy. He came for salt, coffee, nails. But when he saw her, Marin, bleeding in the street with 2 newborns pressed against her chest, his horse slowed. He would have kept riding. He nearly did. But then a man stepped out from the alley. Her brother-in-law, the same man who'd thrown her into the snow that morning, spat at her for birthing girls instead of the boy he was owed. He walked toward her now, red-faced with whiskey and pride, boot cocked back like a threat. Callum's voice cut the dusk in half. "You raise that boot, and you'll lose the leg." The man froze mid-step. His eyes flicked to the rider, and the gun holstered loose at his hip. Callum didn't repeat himself. He dismounted slow, the leather of his saddle groaning with memory. He walked past Marin without looking at her, stood between her and the man. "She's not yours anymore," Callum said low. "She never was." The brother-in-law scoffed. "You gonna keep her? Like some charity case?" Callum said nothing, just looked at him, long enough that the man stepped back. "She'll be dead in a week," the man muttered and turned. Callum turned to Marin then. She couldn't meet his eyes. She looked at the road, at the twins, at her hands, shaking. "You're coming with me," he said. That was it. No offer, no kindness in the voice, just a direction spoken like a fact of weather. She didn't speak. She pulled herself up, legs barely holding, adjusted the sling on her shoulder. One baby whimpered softly. She held him closer. Callum mounted again, pulling the reins loose. He didn't offer her a ride. He didn't reach a hand down. He just turned his horse, slow and sure, and started down the road out of town. She followed, and the sun disappeared behind them, leaving only hoofprints and broken silence in the mud. The trail to the ranch wound through thick pine and jagged stone, narrowing until it felt like the world itself didn't want to be followed that far out. Marin walked behind the horse in silence, her boots sinking in soft snow melt and her arms aching from the weight of the twins. Callum didn't speak. He didn't look back, just rode steady, like a man who'd made a decision he didn't plan to explain. By the time they reached the homestead, dusk had hardened into night. The moon cast a weak glow over a place that looked forgotten even by time itself. The cabin slouched under its own age, planks warped, shutters broken. A rusted weather vane squeaked atop the barn. Fences leaned like tired men, and the wind whistled through missing boards. Callum dismounted, tied his horse, and walked toward the barn. Merrin followed, her breath visible in the cold. He opened the side door and pointed inside without stepping through. There's a cot. Blankets should be clean. I'll leave bread and coffee near the gate. Then he turned and left without waiting for her reply. The inside smelled of wood rot and mice. Still, the cot was there, and she collapsed onto it, the twins still against her chest. She laid them down gently, layering the blanket beneath them, then sat beside them with her back to the barn wall. Her hands trembled as she peeled off her ruined shoes. One toe was bloodied. The other had gone white. She didn't cry. In the silence, her daughters stirred. One made a soft cooing noise. The other reached blindly, hand curling around Merrin's finger. She spoke to them in a whisper. Nothing sweet. Just names. Just breath. Lena. Ruth. You're safe. By morning, the coffee and bread sat at the barn gate. Still warm. No note. Over the next days, Merrin learned the rhythm of the ranch. The man never entered the barn. Never spoke more than 2 words. He rose early, worked all day, mending fences, hauling wood, splitting logs with the same expressionless rhythm. Smoke curled from the chimney, and sometimes a dog barked at the wind. Merrin would catch his shape on the porch, still as a carving. Smoking, watching, but not at her. Not quite. Inside the barn, she swept out the straw, folded her blanket into a crib for the girls, and scrubbed the old floor with melted snow. She found a cracked mirror under a pile of tools, polished it with her sleeve until her face looked back at her, swollen, tired, unfamiliar. She didn't fix her hair, just tied it low, out of the way. When the girls needed water, she built a fire from old cedar and snowboiled the rags. One night, she burned her wrist reaching over the iron pot. She bit her lip and didn't scream. They were alive. That was enough. The silence between the barn and cabin stretched like a taut wire. She didn't try to cross it. She didn't ask for anything, but she began to fix things. Quiet things. A fence post near the barn that wobbled. She packed it with stones. A broken latch on the feed room. She twisted old wire to hold it shut. And she sang, sometimes, low and humming, when she rocked Lena or Ruth in her arms. Not lullabies, just notes from her past. Just sound to keep the ghosts away. One evening, with the girls asleep, she explored deeper into the barn. Behind old crates and dusty plows, she found a pile of children's things buried beneath a moth-eaten quilt. A leather ball, a carved spoon, and a small wooden horse, hand-painted, with initials burned into the side. Yota. She held in her hands for a long while. The legs were chipped, the paint peeling, but it had been made with care, carved by someone who knew how to love a child, someone who had once expected joy. She cleaned it gently, wrapping it in cloth, and left it at the cabin steps the next morning without a word. Later that day, Callum sat on the porch longer than usual. The toy rested on the railing beside him. He didn't touch it, just looked out across the field, toward the trees where shadows moved like memories. His dog lay at his boots, ears twitching. He lit his pipe and stared into the horizon like he was looking through time itself. He remembered the spring creek, the flash flood, the scream that came too late, the boy's braid floating like a ribbon in the water, and the woman who blamed herself more than she blamed him. She had begged for help once. He'd refused to let strangers in, not with a sick wife, not with a baby on the way. She left in silence. He let her. And 3 winters later, word came that she'd died, alone in a frostbit cabin over the ridge. He never buried her, never found the strength to cross that ridge. But he kept her braid tied to the saddle horn, leathered and sun-bleached. A piece of her always riding beside him, even when he stopped speaking her name. That night, Merrin sat awake in the barn, watching moonlight paint silver lines across her daughters' faces. Her hands ached, her ribs still bruised from the kicks. But she felt something shift, not warmth, but space, a silence that didn't crush, just held. The first gust struck like a slap, sudden and sharp, stirring dust and snapping the clothesline rope against the barn door. Merrin froze, her hands still wet from wringing cloths, the metal basin beside her steaming in the cold. A second gust followed, then a long, low howl through the rafters, as if the woods themselves were mourning. Snow had begun to fall just after dusk, but now it came sideways, heavy, sharp, merciless. Through the narrow cracks in the barn wall, the wind clawed like fingers, scattering straw and rattling the lantern hook. Marin swaddled the girls tighter and looked up. The barn roof groaned, not just with age, but with weight. Ice layered the edges, snow collecting fast. The timber at the center beam bowed inward, barely noticeable, but she noticed. Before she could move, the door flung open hard, and wind stabbed him behind Callum's tall frame. His coat was crusted in ice, hat dripping, hands already white from cold. He didn't speak, just looked once at the sagging beam above her, then strode forward and, with unexpected gentleness, scooped up both girls, still asleep, into his arms. Marin instinctively backed away, but he was already at the door. "You're coming inside," he said. Not a command this time, just truth. She followed. The snow bit her face, soaked her boots. By the time she stepped over the cabin threshold, her dress clung to her legs and her fingers were numb. The fire inside cracked and hissed, casting long shadows across the walls. Callum laid the twins into a cedar-lined cradle that hadn't moved in years, then disappeared down the hall. Marin stood motionless, dripping onto the floor. When he returned, he held out a thick wool shawl, dark gray with a single blue thread woven through. It smelled of cedar and smoke and something older, memory. She looked at it, then at him. "I can't," she started. "It's clean," he said simply, "and warm." Her hands reached out slowly, like her body made the decision before her mind caught up. She wrapped the shawl around herself and the girls. It was coarse against her skin, but it held heat, the kind that came from years of waiting in silence. The storm outside roared louder. A tree branch slapped against the roof. Thunder rolled over the hills like drums. One of the twins stirred, whimpered. The other let out a high, reedy cry, the kind that didn't sound strong. Marin rushed to the cradle. The baby's breaths came too shallow, her chest rising and falling in tiny panic puffs. I can't warm her fast enough," Marin whispered, rocking, voice tight with fear. Callum knelt beside her, slowly, not to take the child, just to be near. And then he did something she didn't expect. He hummed, a low, gravel-soft melody, no words, just sound. Crooked and unsteady. It wasn't beautiful, but it was familiar. A lullaby not from books, but from barns and firelight. Something he had once sung when his own child wouldn't sleep. Marin watched him, eyes wide. He didn't meet her gaze, just kept humming, one hand on the side of the cradle. The baby's breathing began to steady. The other twin curled closer to her sister. When Marin finally sat back, her arms limp from holding, Callum rose and poured her a tin cup of coffee. She took it with both hands, sat near the fire. They didn't speak for a long time. Wind pressed against the shutters. Sparks rose up the chimney. Somewhere outside, the dog barked once, then fell silent again. Finally, Marin's voice broke the still. "They beat me because I gave them daughters," she said. The words came quiet, but they held weight. Said I ruined the family name. Said I was cursed. But I wouldn't trade them for the world. Callum looked up from his cup. His eyes weren't soft. They were storm-worn, scarred, but they held stillness. "You didn't ruin anything," he said. She met his gaze. No fear now, just a tired truth between them. "They wanted sons to work the land," she murmured. "But it was the girls who made me want to live." He nodded once. "I had a boy," he said after a moment. "Didn't live past 5 winters." Marin blinked, but didn't interrupt. He liked horses. Couldn't stay off him. Even the creek couldn't scare him. The wind rattled again, then paused, as if holding breath. Marin looked into the fire. Her lips trembled once, not with cold. Outside, the storm began to lose its teeth. The windows no longer shook. The flames settled, curling in amber waves. In the quiet, she leaned back slightly in the chair, shawl wrapped tight. The twins slept again, side by side in the cradle that once held another. And Callum sat across from her, sipping slowly, the lines on his face less rigid than before. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was shared. The storm passed, but winter stayed. Days were a dull gray coat, and nights pressed in early like a hush no one dared disturb. The air inside the cabin hung thick with wood smoke and something else. Not tension, but the soft weight of lives learning to breathe near each other. Maren began to cook. At first, just beans over the iron stove. Then biscuits, rough but warm, shaped by hand and dusted in flour, she found stored in tins high on the pantry shelf. She moved through the kitchen like a ghost, trying to remember how to be flesh again, quiet, focused, never assuming she belonged. Callum didn't stop her, but he didn't join her either. He watched from thresholds, leaning against the porch frame or sitting near the stove with his cup. He didn't speak unless she asked something practical. Even then, he answered in short nods or one-word sentences. Still, each morning, firewood was stacked neatly outside. Dry, cut to size, a silent offering. The twins began to thrive. Their cheeks pinkened with warmth and rest. They slept in the old cradle by the fire, fingers tangled together in a way that made Maren ache. Not with pain, but with a strange, slow hope. She swept the floor daily, repaired a quilt with mismatched thread, polished the window glass until the light slanted through like prayer. One evening, the wind had gone still. The girls slept, and Maren stirred stew in a battered pot. Callum hadn't returned from the tool shed. When the door opened, she knew at once something was different. He came in unsteady, not loud, but loose in the joints, the kind of slow stumble that meant drink. His coat was unbuttoned, hat missing, his hair damp with sweat though the air was cold. She moved toward him without thinking. He tried to speak, stopped, then tried again. Attic was clearing it. Found her ribbon. His eyes were glassy. His face collapsed inward. Maren caught his arm as he swayed. She was smaller, but steady. "All right," she murmured. "Sit down." But he didn't. Not yet. He stood there, held up only by her grip, his body trembling like some dam had cracked beneath his ribs. Then he pressed his forehead to her shoulder, just a moment, and wept. Not loud, not wild, just soft, gutted sounds, barely heard over the fire. She didn't speak, didn't shush him, just held her palm to his back, fingers spread, still and firm, like anchoring a man too far out on the water. He whispered her name once, not hers, but his wife's, and she didn't flinch. He slept in the chair that night, a blanket over his shoulders. Maren sat across the room beside the cradle, one hand on Ruth's belly to feel her breath. In the morning, he rose stiffly and tried to speak, but words broke halfway through. "I shouldn't." She cut him off gently. "I don't need your past." He looked at her then, guarded. She reached across the table, placed her hand over his, calloused and still smelling faintly of cedar smoke. "But the girls," she said, "they need you to keep showing up." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not shame, not grief. Gratitude, the kind that had no name. After that, the house changed. Subtly, but it did. Callum cleared a corner for her things. He replaced a broken window pane. She left a biscuit wrapped in cloth on the porch rail before dawn. They still rarely spoke, but kindness hung between them, thick and quiet, like warm air under the door of a room once shut for years. And when Maren laughed, softly, at Ruth's first hiccup, Callum turned toward the sound like he hadn't heard anything so holy in a very long time. The thaw came quiet, not in grand gestures, but in the soft drip of melting icicles, the muddy path where snow once lay thick, and the way Ruth's little fingers reached for a yellow daisy without knowing the world could be cruel. Spring didn't knock. It breathed in, slow, green, patient. Maren stood beside Callum that morning, sleeves rolled past her elbows, hammer in hand. They were mending fence posts along the ridge, the land behind them soaked with meltwater. Birds sang like the silence had lifted a little. The wind was warmer now, not sharp, just curious. Callum showed her how to brace the post with her knee. "You press it here," he said, his hand guiding hers, rough skin to smooth. "That way it doesn't lean." She didn't flinch, didn't move, just nodded. Their hands lingered. She looked up once, saw him already looking down. The moment passed, but it didn't fade. Later that day, she walked back from the river with her hair undone, dark and loose down her back, wet ends curling from sun. She hadn't meant to be seen. But Callum was there, leaning against the porch rail, cup in hand. He didn't speak, just watched. She began to brush it out, facing away. The brush slowed when she felt his gaze. "You look different," he said finally, voice soft. She turned, brows raised in question. "Good," he added. "I mean lighter." She blinked, then smiled, not shy but knowing. "It's the river. Always did like brushing it out after a swim." He chuckled once. Not forced, not awkward. It rose from somewhere near his ribs. Then, for the first time since she'd arrived, he smiled, truly, the kind that creased the corners of his eyes. That night, the cabin felt fuller than it had any day before. The fire crackled warmly. The girls played on a woven rug near the hearth, crawling over old boots and half-built wooden animals. Maren sat in the rocker, nursing a biscuit and a cup of coffee, her braid half finished. Callum passed behind her once, adjusting the kettle. When she laughed, sudden, full-throated, he froze mid-step. It startled him. The sound. Joy. Not restrained or measured. Just there. He turned. "You sound like home," he said. The words hung in the air. She looked at him, long and slow. "I ain't had one in a long time," she whispered. "Maybe we could build something slow." The silence after wasn't empty. It was tender, careful. When she handed him a second cup of coffee, their hands touched, palm to palm, and neither of them let go right away. There was no kiss, no breathless rush, just the hum of firewood settling, the warmth between them a living thing. Outside, the wind shifted. The next morning, it changed. A rider came, dust trailing behind a dark-coated gelding. He dismounted hard, boots loud on the ground. Maren stepped out onto the porch, a baby in each arm. Callum stood at the edge of the steps. Her brother-in-law, Mason, built like hate, thick-necked and cruel-eyed. He didn't smile. "Law says king get the children," Mason said. "And you ain't got a husband no more, nor a claim on that land." Callum didn't speak. Just moved down the steps, slow. "You come here with that kind of talk," he said, voice quiet but edged. "You best not leave anyone waiting back home." Mason spat near his boot. "I got men. Got rope, too. Law don't stop justice." Callum stepped closer. The rifle at his side wasn't raised. Not yet, but the way he carried it made the air heavier. "You bring rope," Callum said. "You best plan to swing from it first." The wind picked up. Mason looked once at Maren, saw how she stood tall despite the twins in her arms. Then he looked back at Callum, saw something he couldn't break. He turned, slowly, mounted, spurred the horse. Dust rose again, but this time it went the other way. Inside, as Callum closed the door, Maren whispered, "I thought you didn't fight for things anymore." He paused, eyes lowered. "I didn't," he said. "Not until you." And then, quietly, as if it had been true all along, "Not until all of you."